Today on the Potential Psychology podcast.
Find a picture, preferably it has you in it, but if it doesn't, then search for something that reminds you of a point in time where you really had a lot of fun, and put it in a frame that means something to you, whether you want to decorate it or not, it's your choice, and put it front and center so that whenever you're questioning why is fun important, you have an artifact right in front of you to remind you that life is good. Why all of this is important is that if we preserve those memories, when we look back at our life, it tends to consolidate as a richer experience rather than, when we live a life that's sort of habituated and we look back at it as the same thing that we did over and over again. So the more of these ways that we have to reminisce and the fun that we've had in life also allows us to sort of index our life as a richer experience overall.
Welcome to the Potential Psychology podcast. I'm your host, psychologist Ellen Jackson, and this is the show in which we explore what it is to be human and how we as humans can fulfill our potential. Hello, I am Ellen, host of the Potential Psychology podcast, and with me is my co-host for this series, Dr. Mike Rucker. Hello, Mike. I can't speak. Hello.
That's all right. Hey, how's it going?
Good. We are here to talk about fun and well-being. It's an ongoing conversation that's proving to be, a lot of fun, but also quite fascinating and filled with plenty of practical tips for creating more fun in your life for greater well-being. And before I ask Mike to tell us what our topic is for this episode, I thought we'd just do a quick recap on the conversation and the topics so far, because we're sort of halfway through. This is the halfway through mark for this series. So, Mike, we did start out by talking about how making time for fun can be better for our well-being than seeking happiness as an interesting concept. So peppering life with a bit of fun rather than the active pursuit of happiness. And in that, we shared your story of implementing positive psychology practices to find happiness, only to kind of have that backfire, and how that led you both to the science of fun, but also some self-experimentation with fun. And of course, that's all covered in your book, The Fun Habit, the pursuit of joy and wonder can change your life, which is, I believe, coming out early next year. Is that right?
Yeah, January 3rd. That's right. Thank you.
January 3rd, we have a particular date. I don't know whether is that global? Do you know?
I'm not sure. I believe so.
Not sure.
Yeah.
We'll check that out.
Yeah.
So that was our first conversation. Our second conversation, we discussed how we can tweak our lives in small ways to find more fun, a bit more whimsy, which I love as a word. It just sounds so magical and light. And we explored your play model for really understanding how we use our time and how we might maximize our opportunities for fun. So kind of sometimes piggybacking those fun activities with other things that we might have to do, or at least having a good awareness of, where we using our time in a way that maximizes the chance for fun.
Definitely. And also habit bundling, temptation bundling, which is a really interesting behavioral science strategy to get the hard stuff done.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was all in our second conversation. And then in our most recent conversation, we started to explore fun in the context of our working lives. So fun at work, but also finding ways to find that, and I don't know if we like to call it the work-life balance or work-life blend, but to craft more opportunities for work activities that we might individually find fun, or maybe create the boundaries or transitions that we need to ensure that our non-work time allows us to have fun. So how do we actually kind of transition so that work responsibilities and work consciousness and the work worries don't blend into times that might otherwise be opportunities for fun? Does that sound like a reasonable summary of where we're at?
That was really good. And
excellent.
Rightfully that, the last episode was, I think we bobbed and weaved, but that's because we definitely explored that, everyone's situation is different. I think, those are interesting constructs, whether it's a balance or a blend, I think really depends on the occupation that you lead and the way that you like your life. If you are one that is able to protect strong boundaries, then a blend might work. If you're someone that really does need some sort of architecture where when your work is done, then balance might be a better framework for you. I know why it doesn't work for some and does work for others. And I think that's just because the nature of work is so interesting now, from the pandemic and on, right? Because it doesn't look like, definitely, most people are stuck in some sort of hybrid environment. So figuring out, what those rules are for you is probably the most important takeaway from that.
Yeah.
And why we had so much fun, digging in, because it really is
geeking out.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, look, it's such a shifting, moving feast at the moment, the whole workplace situation and the nature of work and how, and I think too, to your point there, individual difference in that, not just in terms of your individual work, but also, your personality, your own work style, the way that you manage your home life versus your family life. There's never, and I think this is both the challenging thing of psychology, but also the fascinating thing of psychology, that there's never a one size fits all. And whilst people might like to have the prescription that says this is exactly what you do and this is what works, it's never going to work that way, is it?
No, and I think to start interesting dialogue with you, like an earlier conversation I had today, is just even just the elements of sort of the family dynamic, right? Because, when you are working from home, you have the domestic demands. And what does that mean? We were already over the last, especially here in the States, but I think, in most Western civilizations, this reckoning of trying to have better parity between gender roles. And now that folks are home, that has gotten kind of messy again, right? It's like, well, you're home, can you do X, Y, and Z? Well, is that fair? And so there's all these like additional burdens, and why that's important in the context of what we're talking about is protecting the space to be able to do some of the things that you want to do become important. And because life is so crazy now, right? Because this is, I hate the term, but new normal does apply, right? I mean, it's kind of trying to figure it out and protecting that space, even though now there's one person might think, oh, well, you have autonomy because you're working from home, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I can take on 5 more hours of extra domestic duty. And so those things are so important right now to make sure that, we are having critical conversations, and not just at work, but also within the family unit, because sometimes our bosses don't understand, these internal pressures that happen because the dynamic is new at home too.
And I know from personal experience, those conversations aren't always fun. Very important. They're not always fun. But today I think we were going to talk a little about relishing and savouring. And this is another avenue. So, in the context of maybe being able to find the little snippets of opportunity for fun in the midst of all of that chaos, and how important that is, which has been part of the conversation thus far. Tell us about this idea of relishing and where that fits in.
Well, I think relishing and reminiscing, right? So we won't get too deep into it, but I think we talked about it a little bit. In the book, I describe a set of tools that I call SAVOUR, and R stands for reminiscing. It's the end. And it's this idea that we can take these moments in time that we've created that are fun and expand and magnify their usefulness, right? And so we know that resilience is really based on the ability to know that life is good. And the way that we figure that out is by, one, flexing our agency and autonomy, which we've talked about quite a bit over the last 3 episodes, but then also understanding that we have the ability to create these memories. And the best way to do that is to index that and to think about them. And it becomes really powerful, right? I mean, we know that, or Facebook wouldn't do it for us. But why let an algorithm dictate that for us when we can do that ourselves? And so there's a whole of different strategies, but it really does require some mindfulness to do that, because I think we got into it a little bit, but what we've learned is that unfortunately part of the human condition is to prioritize painful memories because it teaches us what not to do. And so most of our biological responses really have been wired to keep us out of danger, because our body's job is to keep us alive. But we do know through a lot of psychological analysis that when we tend to ruminate on positive things, that keeps us in a better mood. That's the crux of cognitive behavioral therapy, right? And so figuring out ways that work for you to keep sort of fun memories top of mind and to remember them is something that I found that is quite powerful. Like one study that I think is really interesting and affects males more than females, but still in context, is that more than half of males in this research project from Timothy Wilson out of the University of Virginia, when asked if they would rather think in their own thoughts for 10 minutes or receive an electric shock, took the electric shock. More than 1 out of 2 men, and I think a little bit over 1 out of 3 women chose the shock. So that's just kind of profound to think that there's a a significant amount of people that would rather experience pain than even just ruminate, right?
Yeah.
And so if you are sort of armed with the knowledge that you probably have a predisposition to worry, then what can you do about that? And one of the best ways is to just kind of schedule time to savor, whether that is a journaling practice or having keepsakes, whether that's photo albums, or I keep a treasure chest of mementos that I often go back to if I'm sort of in a state where I need an uplift, and I'll go back and they're well curated, right? So each one is a tangible artifact to bring me back to that really special moment. I know, for folks that are watching on the video, I've got peppered around, my office. This is me and my best friend at a ski trip. And then I have this picture of me and my brother going on one of our favorite roller coasters. And so, those sort of things to sort of remind you that life is good is one of the best ways to sort of amplify fun's power. And so whether that's through reminiscing or savoring after the fact, these are really powerful tools when used judiciously.
Yeah, fascinating. Firstly, so many things in there that I want to pick up on, but the first one was just...
I just gave the bullets for the rest of the podcast, so we can work through each one.
The thinking thing I find fascinating. I mean, that data in particular is amazing. I mean, maybe not surprising in some ways when you think about some of the mental health struggles that we know exist in our communities. Alarming in many ways that people might prefer an electric shock than to be left alone in their thoughts. And I do wonder whether perhaps it was the same academic who I heard on our local radio very recently talking about this notion of what goes on in our heads, what thoughts are happening at any given time, and the degree to which that varies, which I found fascinating. As somebody who spends an awful lot of time in my own head, usually in the positive sphere, that was the other thing that was interesting to me recently, a conversation I think perhaps triggered by something that I'd heard just with my husband about, where do your thoughts go? And I realized that my thoughts largely go to the future and to the present. I very rarely ruminate on the past, but that was at almost 50, a discovery. We're growing and learning all the time, so still discovering what's going on in my own head, even though I spend a lot of time there. So the notion of having some practical things that can actually bring you back then to those positive experiences. And for all that there are challenges around social media, I actually love that the photos of my children, the photos of family holidays, those things pop up because they do give you those little moments of, wow, remember that? And wasn't he so cute when he was 3? And, even though probably at the time I was not feeling like my children were particularly cute at the age of 3, especially when the photos of them having tantrums or whatever it might have been, but having those sorts of things. But then also, consciously using some strategies to be able to amplify those fun and positive experiences to bring you back to them.
Yeah,
I'm trying to cast my mind around the things that I might do. That's the first one that comes to mind, is just those memories. And I know people share them as well, because obviously they do provide those positive moments as well to be able to kind of, cast back. And sometimes perhaps they're even bittersweet moments. Does that fit into fun? Right. Can things be bittersweet and still...
Oh, absolutely. And I think there's a couple of reasons, right? One, as you mentioned, we all kind of have a purview that's different, right? And so you can definitely have a melancholy or bittersweet slant. I actually like that word because Susan Cain uses it, an author that I enjoy. And those can be really rich memories. And so maybe, to the outside world, they don't look like fun memories because you're not clicking your heels on a beach, but to you, it really signifies something that's very important. And so thinking about it is pleasurable, even though, again, it might not be perceived that way by others. And so, it really depends on who you are. And that's why, again, fun is so important to actualize, because it doesn't matter if other people don't think it's fun. If it's something meaningful to you, listening to a sad song, let's say, right? Like that can be a really pleasurable experience for a lot of people, yet we're not going to market it that way because for whatever reason, that doesn't fit the Western ideal. But another thing that I think to unpack, the fact that we're letting algorithms sort of dictate what memories do pop up, because if you think about it, right, yes, this is very fun, but you're still having what is essentially artificial currency having that dictate for you, because they really do bubble up what gets the most likes and comments, because they figure they're setting the stage for what the currency is to dictate what memories you get to see. So the way you can take some power back is really just feeding those into whatever scheduling software you use. And so oftentimes more intimate photos that you would never post on Facebook are actually the ones that are going to bring back richer emotions and hopefully pleasure. And so why would you want to share those anyways? So you kind of share them with yourself, and then you get brought up and you're like, oh my gosh, that special day with my partner was a year ago. And generally when it's something that is that intimate, it also triggers kind of a cascading effect where you want to reach out to that person and remind them that, hey, this is really cool and I was thinking about you and maybe we should do it again. Where Facebook and Instagram and things that sort of do it for you passively, it tends to give you kind of a smile, right? But then you move on. Maybe you'll, use the messenger function. I certainly do this. So I'm not going to say that's not, like if I see a really sweet picture of my kids, I'll forward it to my wife and go, remember this. But it tends to be a really passive activity where we have timelines that are personal to us. And those moments are a lot more richer and more intimate when we share, because we'll open up the picture book or it will instill like, hey, do you remember this? And it's definitely something we wouldn't share outward because it's so personable rather.
Yeah, that's interesting. So there's a really personal element of this and a consciousness, isn't it? It's an active strategy and something that we can actively incorporate into our daily lives, particularly possibly if we feel that we do need more regular mood boosts, maybe.
Yeah.
So lower periods, mood-wise, this could be a really conscious, active strategy without having to kind of dwell into the whys and the wheres and the hows. It's the doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Like if you find yourself, one, reaching for your phone, because again, I think we've explained valence now, but again, negative valence just means you're in a state where you kind of want to get yourself out of discomfort. And if you're going to pacify boredom, why go to your phone when you can go to these kind of curated assets that 100% are going to bring you into something that is enjoyable. And then especially for the parents that are listening, being able to have photo books that kids can kind of play with, so that you're teaching them sort of the importance of things that are tangible. And again, if it's your wedding album, there's so many services now that can recreate, a second asset at a much cheaper price if you're worried about, your expensive photo album getting sticky fingers and stuff like that. And those things are a great way not only to bring you back into the fun you had, but share it with your offspring. And so that becomes important. I think just to make sure that I touch on it too, when we are sort of reminiscing, I don't, again, want to prescribe toxic positivity. I think it's also important to unpack some of the unpleasurable experiences we've had. One, so that we can process them, because we know that's an important way to do it. But that two, we can learn from it and realize, what we don't want to do and what we don't find fun, so that we can relinquish ourselves from ever doing something like that again, right? And I think if you don't do that, if you don't sort of process it, one, you carry it, and then two, you tend to not learn from it. So I just want to make that clear that it's not all about puppy dogs and butterflies. Yeah.
And so what would you recommend, Mike, for somebody who perhaps wants to make a start? I mean, even listening to this, we've covered a lot already, who just wants to make a really simple start. Let's just break it down so that it's not overwhelming, because we are talking about a lot of emotional element here, a lot of emotional content, both that kind of bittersweet, the positive, but also perhaps the uncomfortable. And as you say, some of those intimate experiences are a real blend of some of those sorts of things. So what would be a really easy first simple start for somebody who wants to perhaps incorporate this idea of creating a bit more fun in this sense into their lives?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I suggest for folks that haven't gotten started at all, right, is find a picture, preferably it has you in it, but if it doesn't, then search for something that reminds you of a point in time where you really had a lot of fun, and put it in a frame that means something to you, whether you want to decorate it or not, it's your choice, and put it front and center so that whenever you're questioning why is fun important, you have an artifact right in front of you to remind you that life is good. And so even just that simple trigger, right? Sort of the behavioral science in me, but we know how important our environment is. And so to have that artifact that you can savor and relish, whenever you're questioning, why we're here, you have that reminder of like, oh yeah, it's because life is good and there are times where I can find pleasurable moments. So that's sort of the pedestrian first step. Then if you're already kind of in that mode and you already have that kind of stuff, being able to create some sort of repository for collections of things so that you have these artifacts around that will sort of act as triggers where you can prime yourself to think about the good things when you are bored. And again, just as we said, how complex fun is the individual, some of these might not resonate with you, but hopefully some do. Scrapbooking's a big thing that certainly doesn't resonate for me. But I do like to make jars. So if I know we're going to a beach, so for instance, we went to Spain, I brought back some of the sand and then I brought back one of the bandanas that we got. And so I made an installation where whenever I look at it, it brings back all those rich memories that we had from that particular trip. If you are a minimalist and you hate stuff, then you can certainly do this in a digital format. And so make, some sort of folder of digital assets. What I would suggest is have one sort of tangible thing that can bring you back, because what we know is that bringing the senses back in can encode richer memories of this. And we touched on it before in a previous episode. Why all of this is important is that if we preserve those memories, when we look back at our life, it tends to consolidate as a richer experience rather than, when we live a life that's sort of habituated and we look back at it as the same thing that we did over and over again. So the more of these ways that we have to reminisce and the fun that we've had in life also allows us to sort of index our life as a richer experience overall.
Which is such a wonderful idea. And I'm even just, as I'm listening to you, thinking about what I've got around my own home and a consciousness suddenly that I have lots of photos of the kids, but they tend to be the school photos that are taken. They're very they're there in their uniform. It's looking a little forced. I thought, maybe I need to be swapping some of these photos out for photos of the family having fun, those positive memories. I do have some. I have some from holidays. We take a family holiday every year with my parents and sister and brother-in-law and their children and the four of us. And traditionally we have taken on the last day of the holiday a photo of the whole group of us sitting together. And I must admit, when I look at those photos and another one that, was just taken in the backyard and it was a laugh because we had to try and use the remote on the camera because we wanted everyone in the photo and there was no one else extra there to take the photo. So we all had a bit of a laugh at this ridiculous attempt at technology and it worked. But you're right, because it's when I look at those photos that I am brought back to that moment and those connections with those people who are important to me and even the physical locations that we're in at the time, which are also places that are important to us as a family. So I'm going to go do a little inventory of my photographs around the house and see what it is needs to be swapped out. And I love the idea. And in the book, you call this a memory garden. Is that right?
Yeah, that's one strategy for sure. And so whatever that garden looks for you, we've talked a lot about some of the dysfunction of the human condition, but one of the positive aspects is we certainly do prune this garden as we go forward, right? And so as long as we have, not to use too many metaphors, as long as we have rich soil, we can sort of forget a lot of the bad as we move forward because we have all of these experiences to sort of fill up our mind. And so that's why it becomes extremely important, because we do tend to sort of prune. And as long as we have positive things to think about, things will get better. We often talk about the U-shaped curve of happiness because we know that as we age, we kind of care less about the things that did hold us back. And as long as we have fertile ground to do so. And so that's why it becomes so important.
I'm thinking about my kids as we're talking too, and the age that they're at, this kind of tween to teen, where you're starting to have this consciousness around emotions and a social consciousness that perhaps didn't exist or they weren't aware of when they were younger, and how we can perhaps start to implement even some of these strategies, because they are simple things, aren't they? They don't feel like, I know for me, quite often we think, and we do, our children are struggling, we're struggling, I need to go and speak to someone, I need to go, but these are just really simple things that we can do that are great starting points. I mean, in no way are we suggesting that if people are really struggling that they don't go and seek professional help. That's absolutely what we want to do. But I think just as really simple starting points to help us gain this and developmentally for kids, to start to have awareness that they have all of this control over their emotional experience of their happiness, to use that term, that perhaps we've never previously spoken about, have we, in societally?
Yeah, and I think the pressures that they have where everything has to be externalized is what's becoming problematic, because then it becomes a reflection rather than something that they're mindfully creating. And so to understand that a lot of that is the way that you're actualizing can be quite powerful, right? Because right now they're actualizing other people's perception of them. And we know, I mean, it's not like that's a new phenomenon, right? We know that a lot of mental illness, that is the underpinning, right? It's just there's some powerful tools that have never existed in our reality to sort of amplify the potential harm caused by, worrying about that sort of reflection, and that the reality itself being the perception of how others feel. And so taking some of that control back becomes quite important. And I think using reminiscing so that you own those memories, but then also using those memories as triggers to strengthen the relationships of the folks that really do make you feel fulfilled becomes extremely important, especially for young people, for sure.
So we talked about memory and this idea of reminiscing. Are there other simple tools? You mentioned music earlier, which is something that I use a lot of for my own mood regulation. Playlists are my go-to usually when I need some kind of lift. Are there any other tools that you use or that the science tells us are useful in this regard?
Yeah, I think any tangible artifact can be that, anything that sort of brings you back into the moment. There are some interesting apps now, and we can put them in the show notes, that allow you to sort of take back control so that you're telling the app, like, hey, this is a particular memory that I want to remember. And so there's certainly sort of the gambit. And then again, I think not necessarily gratitude journaling per se, but a journal where you do keep a sort of rich index of things that you want to remember becomes important. So that's another sort of important tool in that toolbox.
So a positive memory journal.
Yeah.
Something like that.
But also, using it as the ability to understand what you don't like either. But I like what you said before. I mean, it ties into Carl Dweck's work about how do we also facilitate through this practice the idea that we should have a growth mindset, that everything that we sort of explore through curiosity, wonder, and awe, and I know we're going to get into that in the next episode, but that all of these things, sort of bring stuff to us and connect us to something that's sort of larger than ourselves. And so that we feel this connection to the outside world that's not based on this false currency of likes and comments from, an invisible army of folks that don't really matter to us, but we feel like they do because, we're being primed in that direction to care about a follower count of at least 10,000 people where you couldn't tell me who they were if I showed you a picture of them, right? And so taking some of that back and realizing how important intimacy is to our well-being, and memories really help us do that, because you're not going to remember folks that don't matter to you. And so being able to bring that into whatever repository makes sense for you, whether that's writing it down, whether it's a song list on Spotify, whether it's, the menu from the best meal you had with your partner, or maybe when they proposed to you, anything that brings you back into that moment and not losing sight of that, as long as it brings you back joy. Obviously, you don't want to collect a bunch of bric-a-brac and then you're like, what the hell is all this crap?
Yeah. Marie Kondo would not like that.
Yes, right.
The bringing you joy part is the important part of that principle, isn't it? They have to be things that bring you joy.
But I'm going to sit with the idea, because I think that's something that I think all of us do. It is an interesting, the school grade photo. Everyone always just walks past those. And I think when you have a collection of them, so you see your children grow, that becomes important. But then that still is all the memories in between. Those pictures don't do much, right? And so I think that's a great metaphor for, why things that are important to you do become these rich tools for reminiscing. And the research around savoring, reminiscing, and relishing, we just know that that's one of the most powerful things that we can do with regards to building our own resilience for things, when they go bad. And so that's why that practice really does become important. Obviously we need to do the fun things to have those types of memories, but to make sure that you are engaging in that type of practice, especially during times where you're just trying to relinquish the discomfort from boredom, is one of the best ways to sort of expand the power that fun has for all of us.
I think that's a beautiful way to finish off. We're taking back our power and we're amplifying those experiences we've already had for the benefit of our well-being. Thank you, Mike, for another great conversation. I always feel like we could just go on, but we will, because we will be back for our next episode where we will be talking about awe and wonder, amongst other things, which are some of my favourite topics. So I'm looking forward to that. Thank you again. We'll see you soon.
Take care.
So what will you do to amplify the fun you have in your life? Take more photos and put them in a frame or frames. Collect and display some meaningful souvenirs. Or do you have another idea? Maybe you do something already. Please let us know all about it. How do you go about amplifying fun's power? That's our listener question for this episode. Remember, amplification is about savouring, relishing and reminiscing. So maybe you do one more than the other. Which do you do? And how do you go about it to make sure that you're maximising the power of fun for your well-being? If you're listening via Spotify or Anchor FM, you will see our Q&A question in the notes for this episode. You can pop your response in there. It's private, so no one else will see, but I would love to hear from you and we can have a little conversation via these clever new features of these platforms. If you're not listening on Spotify or Anchor, we're asking the same question on our social media channels, and you can always send me an email via the Potential Psychology website, which is potential.com.au. You might have noticed it's starting to look a little different over there with our new rebrand for the podcast and some updates to the website. While you're there, you'll also find the show notes and a transcript from today's conversation and a great Q&A with Mike. If you haven't checked that out, you can find out a little bit more about him and how he came to do the work that he does in fun and well-being. Don't forget, also, you can now become a special VIP member of the Potential Psychology podcast community with access to bonus episodes, which haven't quite made it live yet. They're not far off. To find out more, you can head to the website, again, potential.com.au, or to anchor.fm/potential psychology/subscribe. And my new mini online course, Thriving Post-Pandemic, Tips for Wellbeing and Well-Doing, about which we've had some wonderful feedback. So thank you to those of you who have provided that. It's live on the website. It is me exploring the impact that the pandemic has had on us, and then providing some practical tips and strategies for getting from just surviving back to thriving. We're in a new phase now. If we call it post-pandemic, current pandemic, whatever the pandemic is, we're in. It surely hasn't gone away, but certainly things are feeling a little more normal than they used to. But we have a whole new set of challenges. So I talk about what those look like and these kind of phased ideas of pandemic. And then, of course, what we need to do to really be at our best as we grapple with this current way of living, working, and what the future might hold. It's only an hour or so of video content with downloadable guides, and it's only $50, so it's a small investment for a thriving life. I will be back with Dr. Mike Rucker in our next episode to talk about type 2 fun. Didn't know that was a thing, did you? I certainly didn't. And how and where to find awe and wonder in order to broaden your perspective and feel good about life. Thinking about fun in some slightly different ways. It's not all just about fun. Awe and wonder is a form of fun. That's all in our next conversation. Until then, stay well, stay safe, and take small steps to fulfill your potential.